professor here and a historian of science, and I am delighted to introduce Carl Apun as this year's George and Dorothy Carson Memorial Lecturer. The Carson Lecture is named after the late George Carson, a longtime professor of Russian history at OSU, and his wife Dorothy. Carl is an associate professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. He received his PhD in history from Northwestern University in 1999, where he studied with Ed Muir. Broadly, Carl's research examines the relationship between humans and non-human nature in early modern Italy. His first book, A Forest on the Sea, Environmental Expertise in Renaissance Venice, which was published by Johns Hopkins in 2009, is one of the most innovative works of history that I've read in the past decade. In it, Carl looked at forest management in Venice and the Veneto from the 15th century to the 18th, employing a wide range of written and manuscript sources. It's fundamentally changed our views of early modern forests and forest management, because really nobody had actually looked at that very much before, and the role played by technical and scientific expertise. The book won, justifiably, a number of prizes, including the American Historical Association's Herbert Baxter Adams Prize for the best first book in European history, the Charles Weyerhaeuser Prize from the Forest History Society for the best book in conservation history, and the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Prize from the Renaissance Society of America for best book in Venetian studies. Carl has received research support from Fulbright, the ACLS, the Columbia Society of Fellows in the Humanities, the American Academy in Rome, the Institute for Advanced Study, and the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation, which is one of the pluses of working on Venice. His current book project, from which today's talk is taken, has a wonderful title of Rinderpest in the Age of Reason. It concerns a history of veterinary medicine in 17th and 18th century Italy, and looks at the connection between widespread zoonotic diseases, particularly bovine diseases, changes in the Italian diet, and the establishment of veterinary medicine as an academic discipline at the University of Padua. The title of his talk today is An Enlightenment in the Stables, Veterinary Medicine and the Limits of Agrarian Reform in 18th Century Italy. Please join me in welcoming Carl Apun to OSU.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. I've got a few images to show you, and as Anita said, this is a talk that's taken out of a, I hope, nearly completed book project, and that I've been working on for a number of years now. Without further ado, are there any veterinarians in the audience? Okay, all right, excellent. I need to know that because there are a couple of things. I want to make clear that I'm not completely ignorant, and this will become clear to the rest of you at a certain point. So it's always good to know when there are vets in the audience. Okay, on the 26th of August, 1724, the Venetian public health authorities, the Provveditori alla Sanità, so I'm just going to call them Sanità for most of the talk, and so when you hear that word, just think public health, issued an emergency proclamation, having received word of an outbreak of an unspecified disease among sheep in the neighboring Duchy of Milan. The elected heads of Venice's Sanità were eager to impose immediate prophylactic measures throughout the Republic's mainland territories, and in particular they wished to avoid direct contact between Venetian sheep, or sheep owned by Venetians, and Milanese sheep. And to that end, they suspended commerce, or at least ovine commerce, with the duchy. So here are some of the rules that they imposed. Live animals could not be bought or sold across the border until further notice, but neither could mutton, wool, or any other primary or secondary product of the sheep trade. That is to say, in the summer of 1724, Venice imposed a good old-fashioned quarantine. And this was the public health measure par excellence in the early modern period. It's the one thing everybody knows about the early modern period is they were really good at quarantines. The only unusual feature is that it targeted a specific domesticated animal rather than people. So, from the very first outbreak of plague, or the famous Black Death in Italy in 1348, public authorities had viewed halting the movement of people and material objects as the first and best recourse available. So the Pistoia is a town in northern Tuscany, the Pistoia plague ordinances, which are perhaps the best known legal document from 1348, actually list a large number of material objects, including things like bolts of cloth, that were forbidden to cross the threshold of the city for the duration of the emergency, because they weren't sure where the disease originated, and they thought it might adhere, or at least adhere in some sense, to any number of material objects. So naturally, not everybody appreciated quarantine restrictions, and regulations were very often observed in the breach. But the archives of nearly every European state in the early modern period are rife with quarantines broken by everyone from smugglers seeking profit to people intent on making votive offerings at a nearby shrine. For European states, then, the fight against epidemic disease was not just a struggle against the many possible causes of mass illness, but it was a struggle to control both individual and group behavior. And in many ways, the late 17th and 18th century response to cattle plagues fits quite well within this narrative. The sanità that blocked sheep commerce with Milan in 1724 was the same institution that had intervened in the famous epidemics of 1575 and 1630. These were outbreaks of some form or suite of epidemic diseases. And indeed, the quarantine measures, burial practices, and other strategies employed by this magistracy to combat epizootics were by and large the very same rules that public health officials had used to limit the spread of epidemics of all kinds. In other words, by 1724, this quarantine system, it was an automatic reflex. It was a well-tested political and medical mechanism, and it required no debate. So, in this sense, just looked at from this angle, 1724, sheep quarantine, it appears to fit seamlessly into a longer history of prophylactic measures that were taken in medieval and early modern Europe. However, if the emergence of epizootic events, as opposed to epidemic events, as a major medical problem in the late 17th century appeared to confirm the power of these institutions and these procedures, it also challenged ideas about disease that underpinned those same institutions in increasingly important ways. Quarantine might well have been the best available resource or response for both an epizootic and an epidemic event, but animal plagues turned out to be really different from human plagues. And those differences ultimately forced some medical thinkers, at least for a brief period of time, and this is the time that I'm interested in, and state officials alike, to reassess a number of deeply held beliefs about contagion and public health. Now, there's this is for the vets, there's a contractual obligation whenever you talk about animal plagues, 18th century animal plagues, to show this image. This is the image, the most famous image of Rinderpest. It's a Dutch engraving. You see the cows looking slightly ill. You see, and some rather alarmed farmers complaining to a very high-handed aristocrat who's telling them, don't worry, don't worry. Of course, there's a lot to worry about. So it's one of the central contentions of the book project from which this talk is drawn, that because epizootic diseases proved far more challenging, in fact, and threatening than the more familiar epidemic ones, they became a central issue not just in the realm of institutional practice of public health authorities, but in 18th century medical thought more broadly. And for contemporaries and historians alike, so the most obvious result of this was the invention of veterinary medicine as a separate professional discipline. It had not existed before the 18th century, at least not as such. But debates over the etiology and consequence of epizootics also served to draw medical writers and public health officials into realms of thought and practice that had previously lain well outside of their purview. As beef cattle, which were the primary vector for these events, became an increasingly important part of the rural economy, physicians, human physicians, interested in epizootics became enthusiastic contributors to debates within a relatively new field of what we would call agrarian science. So it's good for OSU. Have an ag school, because no public health system, however well organized, could ever hope to contain these kinds of events. Lost my place. Within the increasingly important system of national borders, these were events that crossed boundaries in ways that they found unexpected. Animal diseases emerged as this important feature of legal and political relations between states. I'm not going to talk about this today, although I'll have one image to show you. The reflections of physicians, public health officials, agronomists, and other writers were never coherent. They reflected competing priorities. The most obvious example was the economic imperative to increase stocking densities conflicted with the desire to minimize the economic effects of repeated outbreaks. Nevertheless, the central importance of both epizootic and zoonotic diseases, and this is the moment when I have to editorialize for the veterinarians in the audience. I know the difference. For the rest of you, an epizootic is a disease that affects animals. A zoonotic is a disease of jumps. So avian flu, zoonosis, epizootic. So I'm mostly going to use the term epizootic. I'm largely going to use the term not because some of these diseases might not have been zoonoses, they might have been, but I'm not engaging in retrospective diagnosis. I'm not going to be able to tell you what these diseases are. These diseases come under this kind of blanket category called Rinderpest, which literally means cattle plague. And what's confusing about that is that in the 20th century, Rinderpest actually refers to a very specific disease that has now at least theoretically been eradicated. But in the 18th century, it doesn't refer to that disease. It refers to almost anything that afflicted cows. So cattle plague. So I think, generally speaking, it's just safer to call them epizootics and forget about it. So the central importance of these diseases makes them worth thinking about. So let's think about them. So it might seem so obvious that it doesn't bear any particular mention, but the fact that so many of the biggest public health crises of the 18th century involved animals, and specifically livestock, that this fact raised for people in the 18th century a number of very serious practical and epistemological problems. So it seems obvious, but nobody's really remarked on it that much. So I'm going to remark on it. On the practical side, animals don't behave like people. So people who disobeyed the sanità or other public health authorities or flaunted quarantine, they can be punished. Their ships and goods can be confiscated, they can be burned, they can be imprisoned, or worse. Animals are kind of different. They had minds of their own, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but no capacity to understand or obey laws, and no respect for the kinds of political and juridical boundaries that were the central efforts, the central feature of something like a quarantine. Right? Animals could and did flee from their human masters. They could and did travel great distances, and they could cross any kind of boundary while unknowingly carrying death and social disruption with them. Officials at all levels of the state, at least in Venice, which is the case I'm looking at, were well aware of this. They understood this quite well, and their reflections on the topic actually provide incredibly interesting and amusing reading. So to return to the opening anecdote, the 1724 sheep plague, the Sanità took it as a given that the sheep, both as individuals and collectively, were potentially dangerous independent actors. They admonished local authorities, quote, "In its initial stages, such a disease imbues sheep with a great fury, and they often disperse and become vagrants," unquote. Furious sheep, in other words, acted independently and in ways probably best understood by themselves, which made controlling their movements a monumental challenge. So this emphasis that's in the documents on what I'll provisionally call the animal's agency turns out to be a common assertion in a wide variety of 18th century sources, especially legal ones. But medical and agrarian writers took this idea surprisingly seriously. Thus, the notion that animals acted of their own accord seems to have been well accepted in a surprising variety of contexts. So, for example, 1779, another one of these episodic outbreaks, and these things happen on average about every 4 or 5 years, so they're extremely common. A butcher from a town near Padua bought 2 steers at auction in Venice, and they turned out to be carrying cattle plague. Unfortunately for him and for a lot of other people, it turns out this fact only came to light after they escaped his control following a random encounter with a dog. When the time came to assign blame for a costly episodic event, and they needed to assign blame, the butcher was immediately exonerated. He was the first person left out of the legal case because it was understood, and this is clear, that startled cattle can escape. After which, and this is, they, quote, tend to seek out their fellows, unquote. So the fact that these animals have gotten loose and infected other animals, well, you know, that's what they do. Remaining in the realm of legal definitions, the choice of the term vagrant in that 1724 dispatch I quoted before is also, or at least it seems to be, significant. Vagrant was certainly a common pejorative term in the period, but it was also actually a juridical term, and it had a pretty precise meaning. It meant landless, usually unmarried men who wandered outside their home jurisdiction without authorization or true purpose. That's what a vagrant was in legal terms in 18th century Italy. So to call the sheep vagrants implied that caught up in their diseased furor, the animals became lawless and wandered without fixed destination. They caused trouble. And like their human counterparts, furious vagrant sheep needed to be visibly branded, so they would often brand bandits in this period as a way of making them identifiable, so that potential victims could see the approaching danger and act accordingly, which is to say, shoot first, ask questions later. The Sanità decreed that, quote, so that they may not go wandering and contaminate healthy herds, all infected animals, or even animals just suspected of infection, should be marked on their flank with a red semicircle, unquote. But the animals' lack of self-discipline was far from the only practical challenge that these new diseases posed. Human diseases, epidemic diseases in the early modern period, were largely urban affairs. Diseases flourished where populations were dense and living conditions poor. So that's not to say that rural areas did not experience spikes in mortality during epidemic events. They did. But the institutional and political focus of these public health institutions was always on cities, and especially on port cities and market towns, because those were the key nodes through which diseases traveled. Episodic diseases, of course, flipped this familiar script on its head. The outbreaks still occurred where populations were dense and living conditions poor, but for large domesticates, this meant rural areas, pastures, and especially large barns. This becomes actually the environment that these writers become incredibly obsessed with controlling, is the environment of the barn. If the animals themselves were hard to control, so were the areas in which they lived. There were no choke points, such as docks or city gates, where they could set up controls. And so officials were often overwhelmed by the challenge of maintaining quarantine in large, open, or rural spaces. And we don't have to guess about this again. So I'm going to read you a quote, and this is actually the thing that got me interested in this. I read this in a totally different context, and I noticed this sentence, and I just thought, wow, something's going on there, I need to know it. So what I'm going to tell you now is how I actually came to find this project. So during a major outbreak in 1705, the Venetian governor at Palmanova, and I think don't have a map, I'll show you later, near the Habsburg border, wrote to Venice, this is in the most northeastern corner of Italy, wrote to Venice to inform the superiors that he had, quote, sent patrols into the countryside to shoot alien animals. What's an alien animal? And how do you know? Presumably not all sick or foreign animals were conveniently marked with red semicircles. Similarly, in 1738, during another bovine outbreak, the governor of Brescia, this is on the western edge of Venetian territory, very close to Milan, wrote to Venice to say that his men, he had sent his men out in boats to patrol the river. This is the boundary between Venetian territory and Milanese territory at night, so that his soldiers could fire on any cattle approaching the river from the Milanese side, and especially at anyone trying to dump animal corpses into the river. And this is a problem, of course, that in a human quarantine doesn't arise, right? Presumably people aren't dumping corpses into the rivers in large numbers. I mean, probably some, but not, not at the level that you could actually catch them with military patrols on a regular basis. In other words, controlling rural space and animal behaviors was a lot more difficult than isolating people. So from the outset, episodic diseases generated a new kind of practical challenge that existing public health institutions were actually really ill-equipped to handle. Now, each of these practical problems generated a corresponding or a companion epistemological one. The issue of animal minds or animal agency, or perhaps we should just call it the problem of ovine fury, raised a number of crucial questions about the boundaries between humans and other animals. It also challenged Cartesian definitions of the body as a simple mechanical apparatus in interesting ways. Giuseppe Aurus, who I'm going to come back to in a minute, who was the first chair of veterinary medicine at the University of Padua, repeatedly referred to livestock as, quote, machines that suffer, unquote. And in one memorable instance as machines that think. And before you get too excited, the term he used was ragionare, which can have a lot of different meanings. What I take him to mean is that they respond to sensory input in complicated ways, not simple ways. So he's not suggesting that they have full cognition in any way, just simply saying that sensory stimulus can lead them to act in a variety of different ways. There isn't a kind of one-to-one correspondence. There's the famous passage in Discourse on Method where Descartes talks about harming a dog in a variety of different ways, and he says that the yelping of the dog is just an automatic reflex. It's not, it doesn't mean anything. And so Aldous says, no, that sensory input means something, it just doesn't mean what it means to us. The issue of imposing control on rural space, for want of a better term, led many medical writers to reassess some other deeply held views about contagion and etiology, and it also led them to enter aggressively into emerging debates about rural improvement, to the point that practitioners of the new science of veterinary medicine will eventually be found offering advice on everything from barn construction, there's that special environment again, but also to pasture regulation, issues that surely would have baffled physicians in the 16th and 17th centuries. Finally, I don't have time to discuss this today, and perhaps the most unexpected consequence, although the next image will suggest that it shouldn't be, was that physicians began to pronounce strong opinions on how national borders, veterinary physicians, on how national borders, which were an emerging kind of territorial form really in this period, they weren't quite as fixed as we think of them today, should be monitored and controlled. That is to say, the new veterinary medicine even had something to say about issues of state sovereignty, and this was, pardon me, new territory, indeed. And the reason that you might want to say that it shouldn't surprise us is we still think in this way today, right? So this is an editorial cartoon from the swine flu outbreak a few years ago. And what are you bringing in from Mexico? Well, there's the swine flu acting all nonchalant in the passenger seat. There's actually dozens of these things to choose from. And what I want to emphasize is that actually the way that Aldous, this particular professor at Padua, thought about veterinary medicine looks a lot like the way we think about it today. So it's a public health discipline that aims at sort of regulating and controlling the spread of disease in agrarian environments. But that's actually not the way most other people in the 18th century thought about it, so that's important to stress. All right, so very quickly, just a little bit of background, super fast. Venice was the northernmost hub of the peninsular cattle trade, and from a pretty early period, at least the 16th century, but the scale of that trade changes dramatically in the last 2 decades of the 17th century, so from the 1680s on. From a pretty early date, Venetian merchants imported most of their cattle from Hungary, and some also from the Balkans. So there was a transit point here in Zara, and they would bring them up to Venice on specially made ships called manzere, which means like cow barge. And there were regulations about how manzere had to be built and how many cows were allowed to load on it and so forth. But most of let's go this way. And the guy who sent his soldiers out to shoot alien animals is right about there. So it's right on the transit point. But the Hungarian plain was the site of an ongoing and long-term military conflict between the Habsburgs and the Ottoman Empire. And so regular disruptions of war, plague, population decline hampered this trade throughout the 16th and most of the 17th century. And the way it does, they bring them here, they bring them to a transit point in Venice, they auction them there, and then they fatten them on grain in situ as quickly as they can. So they're actually bringing them all year round as best they can in small herds, of 200 or 300 animals, and because they can't refrigerate, so they have to control the supply on the hoof. But the limited scale of this trade before the 1680s meant that beef necessarily remained a minor element in the diet. It wasn't very common. This isn't to say that Italy had no cattle. Italians relied on oxen until a very late date to pull plows rather than horses. And local landowners, especially in the Northeast, actually kept small dairy herds, and these were the ones who usually got infected. But local breeding provided most of the replacement animals for dairy, and only aged beasts, or as we would say, downers, go to the local slaughterhouse. Consequently, foreign diseases epizootics didn't pose a serious threat to Italian livestock in the 16th and 17th century. There are examples, but they're very rare. However, once the Habsburgs scored a decisive victory against the Ottomans at the Siege of Vienna in 1683, this situation changes very quickly. A stable Hungary meant a reliable supply of animals and the possibility for a regular market for beef cattle. And if these denser connections between Venice and Hungary provided protein surpluses and ready access to secondary products, because they used the whole animal, and there were very strict regulations on who would get what for rendering, and candles, tallow was considered a public good, so that was controlled by the state. It was extremely complicated. They had a way of distributing the intestines to the Sausage Makers Guild, and they really did go in for whole animal butchering. They also created the conditions for less benign forms of biotic exchange. And almost as soon as Hungarian cattle started flowing into Venetian territory after 1683, local herds along the trade route began to manifest signs of an unknown respiratory disease. And this is the first, again, of these very regular outbreaks. Witnesses reported, quote, beasts with white foam around their nostrils and difficulty breathing and an unwillingness to take food, unquote. More alarmingly, quote, the affliction moves rapidly from one animal to the next, so that if sick cattle are not quickly separated from the rest, all soon die, unquote. For Venetian property owners and peasants alike, the prospect of an uncontrolled bovine plague caused fear. Because of their reliance on draft oxen, the worst case consequences were presumably apocalyptic. So it's no surprise that Venice and other Italian states developed an immediate interest in controlling the spread of these diseases. So now let's talk about their reactions. As I discussed at the outset, the initial reaction was to extend the authority of existing institutions. But ignorance of rural environments and the treatment of live animals hampered the ability of physicians in the employ of the plague magistracies to mount an effective response. And here I actually want to clarify, because when you talk to audiences of early modernists, they automatically know this and other people don't. A magistracy is always a special kind of institution. It operates both as what we think of as a bureaucracy, but it's also a court of law. So the public health authorities in Venice, they had legal functions. They could actually hear cases and render verdicts, and then the same is true of almost every other institution I'm going to talk about today. So most plague doctors worked from a fairly uniform set of ideas, most of them quasi-Galenic, about disease in the body. And while this framework assumed basic similarities between humans and animals, it also actually made the search for a convincing causal account of the new diseases difficult. And for 18th century medicine, it was important always to find causal claims, to make causal claims, to find causal accounts of why things were happening. Traditional Galenic diagnostic procedures required the physician to look to three things, really, three kinds of qualities of place, let's call them: air, water, and local foodstuffs first, when searching for the cause of an illness. However, producing a sophisticated, what we might call environmental etiology for these diseases would have meant that the physicians had to have a familiarity with the lifeways of large livestock, where they like to go, what they like to eat, that kind of thing. And they didn't have it. The people who did possess that knowledge, as well as meaningful empirical experience with sick animals, were rural farriers, blacksmiths. But given the lack of any meaningful connection or even dialogue between farriers and physicians, it actually proved maddeningly difficult for the Sanitas doctors to access that source of expertise. In other words, the perfect correspondence between the rules for epidemics and the rules for epizootics, our instinct is to say, oh, well, this is the competent thing to do. But I'd actually suggest that it reflected profound ignorance rather than any kind of thoughtful response. They were just doing what they knew rather than, they weren't acting in a really kind of thoughtful way. It was an automatic response. So these new diseases lie beyond the experience of most physicians at the close of the 17th century. Those in the employ of public health institutions evinced surprisingly little concern over their own lack of concrete knowledge of bovine habits or physiology, nor does it appear that they made much of an effort to consult local farriers when investigating outbreaks. The dispatches of public health officials to Venice consistently refer to local farriers and blacksmiths as, quote, rude persons, unquote, sometimes, quote, unlettered, unquote. And these accusations actually would later prove to be ill-founded. There's a survey in 1774 of local farriery practices that this professor August commissions, And it actually turns out that many of these farriers could read and had read quite a bit, or at least they claimed to have read quite a bit. There was a literature, though. Italian printing houses had long been in the business of churning out farriery manuals of various kinds. By the time cattle plagues become a source of concern at the end of the 17th century, these manuals were a well-established genre, not just in Italy, but everywhere in Europe. Such texts as Scacco da Tagliacozzo's L'Anatomia del Cavallo, first published in 91, that's why I made the confusion today. Agostino Columbre's Della Natura dei Cavalli, On the Nature of Horses, 97. And the most famous one that everyone knows, which is an English manual, Markham Gervais's Cheap and Good Husbandry, which was from the beginning of the 17th century. And that was actually the one that was published in most languages, and it went everywhere, across the Atlantic. Gervais was everywhere. The only problem from the point of view of public health officials was that these texts were almost exclusively concerned with equine health. And that wasn't the problem, animal for them. The authors were aiming for an aristocratic audience. These texts all treat the problem of selecting mounts suitable for battle. They explained how to identify the physical traits that were most predictive of a noble character in a horse. Horses are the dogs of the 18th century. So when these writers talk about them, they say, oh, well, you know, the horse is the animal that's most like us. It has courage, it has loyalty, all of those things. That's the horse in the 18th century. These were not the subjects of greatest concern to public health officials, though. Especially ones facing a field full of ailing cows. But literate farriers hoping to profit from aristocratic patronage and employment would have been keenly interested, and this is what is revealed that they read in 74. Nevertheless, texts such as Tagliacozzo's ultimately served as the first bridge between traditional practices of farriery and the world of medicine. By the first 2 decades of the 18th century, abridged versions of treatment regimes taken verbatim from books like L'Anatomia del Cavallo and other farrier manuals begin to appear, in the archives of the Sanità. So they have these kind of standards, they're printed out, and then whenever there's an outbreak, they just mail this kind of packet of here are the remedies. And they're straight out of texts like Gervais, word for word. The complete versions in the manuals, but they're abridged versions. The complete versions of the manuals covered more than just recipes for preparing compounds. They included specific recommendations about the timing of treatment, especially with respect to astrological conditions, which is a staple of Renaissance medicine, as well as advice on such matters as the effects of air quality and seasonal humidity on feed. They're very complicated texts. But public health authorities were mostly interested just in the formulas. They wanted to make compound drugs. And so the recipes that you find in the state documents include very specific prescriptions, such as scraping the tongue with a solid silver knife. We can talk about that if you want afterwards. Or having the beast drink a mixture of red wine and herbs, and then the formula is there through a funnel, this sort of thing. But to the extent that such issues as astrological correspondences appear in public health documents, they're always linked to the administration of drugs. So, for example, it was generally understood that respiratory ailments should not be treated when the moon was full, or Venus ascendant, because the moisture would counteract the effects of the pharmaceutical remedies, right? So the moisture in the lungs and the moisture in the air. This state of affairs held steady for the first, and so actually, just very quickly, because it's worth looking at. So there are tons of these astrological bodies of humans in Renaissance medical literature, but you don't always see an astrological horse. This is Scacco da Tagliacozzo. And so you see it says, you know, these correspondences tell you when a particular constellation is ascendant, is the time to treat a malady of the hoof or the foreleg or the head. What's interesting is that they aren't actually perfectly mapped onto the human ones. So Leo is the heart for human ones, for example, but Virgo's not the foot on the human ones. So they actually have their own unique set of astrological correspondences. Okay. Judging from the next slide, I may actually have the wrong show, but we'll see in just a second. Okay, so this is how it went for about the first third of the 18th century, really till about the 1740s. Bovine plagues flared up somewhere, about every 4 years. Public health officials and local governors would issue quarantine proclamations. The inspecting physicians would show up with their stack of standard remedies. They'd scold the farriers for being unlettered while prescribing remedies taken verbatim from printed farrier manuals, and everyone was more or less happy. The mirroring of regulations designed to combat epidemic plagues produced at best inconsistent results, but panicked local officials seemed happy for the clear rules. So the impetus for breaking this kind of status quo would eventually come from outside the world of public health institutions. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about agrarian reform. 18th century Venice was a very peculiar place. It was 2 centuries removed from great power status. It was kind of a provincial backwater of sorts. The Venetians and their mainland subjects concerned themselves with ambitious projects for internal administrative reform in the 18th century rather than looking outward to what was going on elsewhere. And in particular, the bourgeois residents of mainland cities played an increasingly important role in these projects, which is a real novelty for Venice. Venice is a republic, but it's an aristocratic one, and having bourgeois members of professions be given a voice is extremely unusual, and it happens around this period of the 18th century. So beginning in about the 1740s, mainland elites in subject cities began to establish academies as venues for enlightened debate and springboards for potential reform. The academies attracted men from the professions, lawyers, doctors, and notaries, rather than aristocratic elites or big landowners. In smaller rural centers such as Belluno, so let's go back to the map really quick. So Belluno's up here, it's in the Prealps. It's actually it's about 500 meters of elevation, 600 meters of elevation, something like that. But it was an area where there were a lot of animal herds. Udine and Verona, the academies sought to tackle problems of agrarian reform, and they were actually called Agrarian Academies. The principal goal of these reformers was to free the Republic from the yoke of food imports, or what they saw as the yoke of food imports, through improved cropping and husbandry techniques, and in public relations, pamphlets, essay contests, and through an actual periodical that they published called the Giornale d'Italia. It's the most overblown name for a periodical that was published by 5 or 6 agrarian academies in one corner of the peninsula. The members of the academies debated the best way for Venice to achieve caloric independence. Now, in the Giornale d'Italia, episodic diseases do not assume a prominent position in these debates. The Giornale d'Italia writers are most concerned with crop rotation, seed selection, the use of mineral-based fertilizers, and so on. When agrarian writers did tackle the problem of husbandry in the Giornale, they mainly concerned themselves with stocking densities and pasture management. They used this term artificial pasturing, which basically meant foddering, how to fatten animals without taking up valuable real estate. But despite the apparent lack of interest, if you just look at the Giornale, one segment of the Academy's membership was developing a real interest and actual competency in animal disease by the 1750s or early 1760s. The most important one I'm going to talk about today, but he's representative of a kind of class of people, is a guy named Jacopo Edoardi, and he was a member of the Accademia degli Anistamici in that town of Belluno. He was actually the president of the Academy. And beginning in the early 1760s, Edoardi wrote letters, a number of letters and short essays on the need to find a new approach to the problem of episodic disease. And in 1777, he compiles all of these writings into a manuscript treatise that he entitles, quote, "On the impediments that are encountered in the care of infirm animals and the little attention paid to their preservation." It's a great title. The treatise represented the culmination of 15 years of thinking on the subject for Edoardi, and he pointed to some of the problems that we've already looked at. A lack of systematic knowledge about animal diseases, to the fact that it was useless, he says, to debate stocking densities and foddering techniques if you couldn't keep livestock already existing alive. And he argued that a slavish reliance on traditional practices was holding back the art of animal medicine. It was, quote, "little wonder that livestock are in such terrible health." And then he proceeds to say, and this is a very interesting passage, "In the past, for the care of animals and their diseases, the only people employed were those who did not know how to act, if not behind mere practice, whether such practice was heard or seen or merely read. They knew nothing more," keep that phrase in mind, heard or seen or merely read. "They knew nothing more than that of the art of healing. And thus their enterprise was unfruitful more often than not, and instead of healing the animals, they often accelerated their complete loss." So this passage draws our attention to the most common arguments articulated by writers such as Edoardi's agrarian reformers. While initially it might appear that he's blaming farriers for the crisis, he's actually arguing that farriers and physicians share the blame for the poor condition of livestock. The farriers had heard or seen, and the physicians had merely read. Right? Neither group, he argued, was capable of improving the art because both relied exclusively and blindly on traditions, or at least on the wrong traditions. And both approaches, he suggested, led to the same pernicious result. The solution, in his view, was to approach epizootic diseases as both an agrarian problem and a medical one, and there's a hierarchy here. He wants them to be an agrarian problem first and a medical problem second. It's going to turn out the other way. In Eduardi's view, this would lead to a new medical science he called zoeatrics, which in turn would provide a firm natural, philosophical, or we would say scientific foundation for agrarian reform. Now, Eduardi first uses this term zoeatrics in 1765, but he's not the only person interested in this new science. Calls for zoeatric medicine from physicians in the academies merged with similar rhetoric emanating from within institutions of the Republic. The most enthusiastic proponents of zoeatrics were the members of the Deputati dell'Agricoltura, and this was a brand new magistracy. I think it's established in 58. And it was charged with creating a complete, what we would call land registry of all cultivated land. So they wanted a precise accounting of all land that was under the plow. The Agricultura also decided which projects recommended by the academies deserve state sponsorship. So they're the mediators between people like Eduardi and the state. By the 1760s, members of this new magistracy had taken up the call to action of Eduardi and his fellow academics, and they began pressuring public health authorities in the Sanità to co-sponsor the establishment of the school. The Sanità's initial proposal in 1769 was aimed at establishing a farrier academy, that's what they called it. They said, well, we want an academy where tradesmen can go be trained. But Eduardi was not satisfied with this, and neither were his allies in the Agricultura, and they continued to agitate for an institution that would train proper medical personnel rather than farriers. And they had a very specific model in mind. The veterinary school that the French surgeon Claude Bourgeois had established in Lyon in 1762, and he founded another one near Alfort in 68. Eduardi in particular continually referred to, quote, the French model, unquote, in his writings, but it's clear from the context and terminology that other writers used that they all had Bourgeois school on their mind. So under this pressure from the academies in the Agricultura, the Sanità finally agrees to send 2 students to France to work with Bourgeois, but they remained at loggerheads about the goal of this project. The Sanità imagined that the 2 students would spend 3 years in France and then return to train farriers. It's also clear from the Sanità's letters to the Senate that they never imagined that the 2 students would ever be asked to replace the Sanità's own physicians at the site of an outbreak. So the notion that these 2 students would mostly interact with farriers was consistent with existing public health practices everywhere in Europe. It also corresponds to what most of the graduates of Bourgeois schools in France seem to have done. His first several cohorts of students were almost exclusively sponsored either by aristocratic patrons who wanted them to breed horses, or by military authorities who wanted them to work in the context of cavalry schools. And in both cases, the idea was they would return home and run stables. So the point was that the French founders of veterinary medicine envisioned the new science as taking place in a very limited, specific institutional context rather than becoming a generalized or generalizable practice. And Horus, the first professor at Padua who studied at Alfort, fit this profile perfectly. He wasn't from Venice, he was from Parma, which is, well, not even on this map, but down here, outside of Venetian territory. And he'd been sent to Alfort by the Duke. He was the son of the Duke's personal physician because the Duke was dissatisfied with the quality of mounts in his stables, not because the Duke imagined that Horus would come back and be a public health official. So here the peculiarities of the Venetian context help us to understand why Venice comes out looking different when it comes to the establishment of veterinary medicine. Venice, of course, for obvious reasons, I hope, had no ducal stable. Can't ride horses on water. There was a cavalry school in Verona, but it was really poorly funded and very small. So the people, and some mainland elites were interested in horse breeding. When Horus comes to Padua, he is inundated with letters from aristocrats who want him to buy them a horse in France and this kind of thing. But the people who are calling for the establishment of a school were not these people, they were these bourgeois academics, and they didn't care much about equestrian pursuits. Eduardi never once mentions horses, and in this sense, whatever the Venetians saw when they looked to France and French models, it was not an obvious fit for the culture and politics of the Republic. So they go along with the initial plan, they choose 2 youths. It takes them about 2 years because you have to find someone who speaks French, and it turns out that was very difficult to find someone who was low enough status to go to the school, but also knew French. Odus's father was from France, and that's how he turned out to be such a good candidate. And the other Italian who goes in this period is from Turin, where they spoke French. And then, so they're getting ready, they finally find 2, they're getting ready to send them, and then Eduardi, who had been corresponding with Odus for a number of years, because he knew Odus was in Alfort, finds out that Odus had come back and the Duke had died. And the Duke's son has no interest in this, and he essentially cuts Odus loose. And so Eduardi immediately writes to the Senate and says, don't worry. He says, we need not wait 3 years. We can establish a school right away. And the Senate actually agrees. So they forge an agreement with Odus, and it's a real novelty of an agreement. The Venetian Senate, over the objections of the Sanità, makes Odus a school. They say they're going to establish a school, they're going to finance it, and they put it in the medical school in Padua. It's the only one. And so Odus finds himself at the age of 21 ascending from a graduate of essentially a glorified trade school to holding a chair in one of the most important medical faculties in Europe, even if it's not quite as important as it had been in its glory days. But the new institute was peculiar. To begin with, it occupied an unusual place within the structure of the university. The Senate had given it an independent endowment, taken out of the budgets of the Agricultura and the Sanità, because they want both magistracies to have buy-in. So Odus was not beholden to the university's administration. And we all know how that works out. In exchange for agreeing to this plan, the Sanità demanded and received veto power over the curriculum and over the selection of students. So Eduardi and the agrarian reformers, they got the school they wanted. It was a medical school. But it was a school devoted to train professionals who would be co-opted by the public health authorities rather than be agrarian reformers, which was the whole point. Where they did agree, the agrarian reformers and the public health authorities, was on who should study at this new institution and under what terms. And clearly, under even the most optimistic conditions, an animal doctor would not occupy the same social and scientific status as a human physician. The solution was to recruit students from families of members of lower status medical professions, like sons of apothecaries and so on and so forth. And if you want to know more about this, I can talk at length about how they pick these people. So while the class origins of these students represented potential social problems, they provide the perfect solution to what Eduardi and other agrarian reformers saw as the central weakness of the traditional public health approach to epizootic diseases. As Eduardi had pointed out repeatedly in his own writings, animal health fell into what we might call a professional gap. Farriers lacked the kind of disciplined empiricism necessary to improve on traditional remedies. They had seen and heard. Physicians lacked the requisite knowledge of agriculture and husbandry for their disciplined empiricism to have any effect. They had merely read. So from our perspective, we might also say that the way in which Odus and his collaborators chose to define the expertise of this new class of veterinarians solved many of the epistemological and practical problems presented by the diseases where we started. The zoetrope physician would combine the agrarian knowledge of the farrier with the medical knowledge of the physician. He would know the life ways of large domesticates as well as the subtleties of galenic etiology. At least in theory, a properly trained physician, zoetrope physician, would not simply replicate the practices of human medicine, so not commit the error that the Florentines had committed of just doing the same old thing. Nor would he slavishly imitate the pharmaceutical recipes contained in printed texts. And Odus himself was clearly thinking in these terms from the moment he arrived in Padua. He quickly appropriated the rhetoric of agrarian reform and so on, and it would be easy to dismiss this as just opportunism, but other evidence reveals that he fully embraced this expansive role of animal health and its social importance. Odus's notes from, I have his notes, his student notes from Alfort and his lectures, and we can actually compare. Bourgeois' curriculum devoted nearly all of the 3 years to horses, and there was just a small section on bovines at the end. Odus, by contrast, it was a 4-year curriculum, and the first half was just bovines. He didn't even get to ovines until almost year 3. He also opened a clinic at the school to give his students practical experience with animal diseases. And here's where something interesting happens. He thought that farmers would bring their calves. And that does happen a little bit, but it's in Padua, it's in a city, it's not in the countryside. And so a lot of people bring their animals, but it's not the animals he expected, and Otis just rolls with it. He's very enthusiastic. So the variety of animals brought in for treatment was pretty astonishing. There were dogs, cats, birds, and I think mostly we're thinking here of hunting falcons, but I think there are other kinds of birds too. A mouse, one of my favorites, and the best, and this actually startled everyone in the reading room when I saw it because I just yelped, a camel. And at the conclusion of each academic year, Aldous awarded a medal. This was in his contract. They had to make him two gold medals. One for the best theoretical student and one for the best practical student. And the practice medal went to the student who performed the best in this clinic. So there's something admirable about this whole curriculum. Its emphasis on practical skills, and especially if you contrast it with the hands-off nature of traditional medical training in this period, although it's becoming much more hands-on. But it works, but it doesn't convince the public health magistracy. So let's just now very quickly go back out one more time to one more site of an outbreak to see how this actually plays out in practice. Because Otis, once he's there, he and his students actually go to the site of almost every outbreak. So December 1779, major outbreak of cattle plague on the Istrian Peninsula. And this was, basically there was a border right down the middle of Venice, Habsburgs. And it happens in December of 79, and Otis exchanges a number of letters with local authorities, but in early February, and it's really actually hard for him because they have to do the anatomy lessons in winter for obvious reasons. And so he's about to start the anatomy lessons, but he cancels anatomy lessons, he goes out, takes a couple of students with him, and as always, he keeps copious notes and sent lengthy letters, so we know pretty much what he thought. In his reports, Otis deployed the full range of his expertise. He diagnosed the disease as a respiratory disease, and he says it's not the vulgar pulmonata, which just means of the lung. He identified it as pleuropneumonia. Now, don't ask me whether it's the same pleuropneumonia, I don't know, but that is an actual disease that we diagnose today. The diagnosis was based on observation of the symptoms, coughing, foaming of the nostrils, phlegm, and on postmortem dissections he performed in which congestion of the lungs and heart were described. The learned professor then pointed to a common set of interrelated causes for the disease: filthy stalls, infected pastures, places, sharing troughs with sick animals, water, moving too quickly from cold to the heat and back again. And for those of you familiar with Italian culture today, that should make you smile. Air. All of this caused, quote, a noxious fluctuation in humors, unquote. He recommended a combination of dietary changes, that's the standard galenic treatment, environmental controls as well, and these recommendations, and the recommendations actually came in a form of condemnations of local practice. So he notes, the common practice of farriers and blacksmiths who are accustomed to bleeding the animals only serves to exacerbate the humoral imbalance, makes the disease worse. He didn't like bleeding at all. On the environmental side, he found much to criticize in the way locals managed their pasture. He wanted faster rotations and a prohibition on using any wet grass. Finally, Otis devoted several pages to the most important environment of it all. In his view, the barn. He critiqued local traditions of barn construction. He wanted them to tear all their barns down and reorient them and create new kinds of windows. This way, the animals can be exposed to fresh air, warmed by the morning sun. They will not be left to choke on unhealthy and fetid air. So the reports touch on a remarkable range of issues compared to the earlier ones produced by the 17th Act. He identifies diseases using a medical term that was not part of the farrier's lexicon, pleuropneumonia. He took readers through the postmortems in all their gory detail. He offered up a galenic prescription that took into account what cattle normally ate. He knew what they liked. And finally, he went into considerable detail on the most modern ideas about barn construction. And so on the practical issues as well as the epistemological issues, Otis and his students appeared to be offering far more complete answers than their predecessors. Is it a better answer? I don't know. Still, and I'm going to end here, Otis's authority had very definite limits. He pronounced local barn building techniques inadequate, but it's doubtful that any barns were actually rebuilt in response to his complaints. His authority was also undermined in some sense. The torturous was also under, by the torturous conditions of the school's founding, because the Sanità had only supported the college once it had been forced on them, and it ultimately decided to deal with the imposition of the school by co-opting its graduates. Aldous' voice was ironically far stronger on issues of public health than it was on issues of agrarian reform. It wasn't what the reformers wanted. So the Sanità got curricular control of an institution it had not wanted, while the Agricultura and the academies got an institution that ultimately failed to address the problems they had been interested in. More importantly, when Aldous collapsed and died at the site of an outbreak in 1792, there's a very moving story about this. He collapses into the arms of his favorite student. His college collapsed and died with him. As soon as news of his death reached Venice, the Riformatori allo Studi di Padua, which is kind of the board of regents for the university, petitioned the Senate to take control of the college away from the Sanità and Agricultura. The Agricultura protested, the Sanità didn't. The Sanità declared that while we were quite satisfied with the work of the late professor, we believe that he's already provided our physicians with the necessary knowledge. In other words, the Sanità was perfectly satisfied with the idea that its physicians could return to merely reading. When the Senate complied with the Riformatori's request, and this is why independent endowments never work for long, the Riformatori then changed the curriculum to a 2-year program, quote, more suited to a manual art, unquote. The chair itself was correspondingly downgraded, so it had been the chair of comparative anatomy, and it becomes the chair of animal surgery, which means that the veterinarian is the last person to process. At the very, 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 very end. And it would be another 40 years before another veterinarian would hold the university chair in medicine in Italy. An institution founded in a period of enthusiasm for agrarian reform withered because it had not fully convinced public health authorities that agrarian reform and disease were intimately related categories. So for you veterinarians, know one health. That's the slogan of the World Veterinary Association. So that's it. Thank you.